Okay, welcome back to CE 528, and we are going to start our discussion on CE 528 class. And I want to remind you again that all the lectures for this class that we've been doing, most of it anyway, sometimes I forget to hit record, but then I restate what I've been saying. But most of the lectures for this class are available online, and the link to that playlist is available on your Canvas page. So please do check them out if you do miss some lecture, or let folks know who may have missed some lecture or lab sessions. Okay, very good. Oh, by the way, just so you remember your labs, your coming lab, I mean, you're on Wednesday before the lab. So your lab is due before the lab because I'm going to start a new lab on coming Wednesday. So remember that. Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. And it reminds me that I haven't actually posted these lecture notes. So let me go ahead and post these online. Okay, we're resuming the recording and we're starting the lecture. One thing as I go through this lecture now, please try to make that connection with the previous lecture. You know, you guys are working on that homework. You folks are working on that homework where we're trying to find the expansion path, and as your budget goes up, you know, how many more road or any output that you want to produce. So that gave us that expansion path. We're going to try to do the same thing here. Okay? We're going to try to do the same thing here. We're just going to learn how, as your budget grows, how much of the services you might want to consume, and you'll see that. Okay, so just try to keep that connection between the previous lecture and this lecture alive. So just pay attention to that. See if you can see the analogies between the two. Okay, and as I was saying, utility theory, basically a mirror image of the production theory. The derivation that you're going to see, it's going to have almost a perfect analogy there. Okay, production models describe how producers physically create goods and services. Okay, cost models tie production quantities to dollar cost, like, you know, amount of dollars spent versus kilometers of road produced, for example, right? That's the example we saw. Now, utility models describe how consumers value consumption of goods and services. And then what comes out of that is the demand models that tie consumption quantities to prices. And for most things, as you would know, that the demand model will be downward sloping. You will see that as price of something goes up, the consumption goes down for most goods. But there are exceptions, and those exceptions sort of almost prove the rule, but there are exceptions. And we'll talk about those as well. Let's think about utility. Now, utility is a very almost nebulous concept. It's the perceived benefit to an individual from having or consuming one or more goods or services. Right? Now, you might have seen that the cars of certain colors cost different, right? So like, for example, if you're buying a red BMW car, the model with the racing stripe costs $800 more. I'm just making up some numbers here, but you get the idea that if you have a yellow BMW with no stripe, that is priced as $34,000. And then, but you have a red BMW with a racing stripe, that's cost $34,800. Now, if the price is set and somebody basically buys that red one with the racing stripe, they're basically measuring the utility of that red color and the racing stripe to be $800. Because you must believe, whoever is paying that extra $800 must believe that you're getting something extra. That's the idea. Are you getting something extra is the point there. Utility, the concept of utility, it is an economist's attempt to quantify that psychological something that you get out of that. Now, again, this is not a universal concept. You might think it's pretty stupid to pay even extra money. I mean, I'm driving a 2010 Altima, so I guess I'm just a person who buys a $34,000 car, but I'm cheap that way. But what I'm trying to get at is that everybody has their own utility. And you cannot really question it. You can only you can take almost aggregate consumer behavior and you can make assessments about it. Okay. So it's an economist's attempt to quantify what that psychological extra that you get from buying that different color car and whatnot. And there are different types of utilities. If your shoes were destroyed in a house fire, assuming you have insurance, what would you fairly claim as the value of those lost shoes? Right? I mean, so that's what we call the utility in exchange. But on the other hand, if you need a pair of shoes and you are at a place where you've lost your shoes for whatever reason, and there is another person who has the shoes, how much would you accept to give me your shoes right now? So if there was a person with the shoes who's maybe wearing them, and if they sell you the shoes, they won't have any shoes left to wear right at that second. That's what it's called, the utility in use. And this concept could be coming, I've almost experienced this concept firsthand. And it's a pretty embarrassing story, but I tell that because it makes that point pretty clearly. And, this was a long time ago. This was maybe 12 years ago or 11 years ago, something like that. We were at a beach and I was standing on the pier at the beach. And standing on the pier, I was just kind of doing something stupid, you could say. And I know we are recording this. Okay, I'll still say it. I mean, I've never said that on a recorded lecture, but I've said that to the classes. I've never recorded it, but it's okay, I guess. So, because nobody else is going to look at these lectures other than maybe you guys, but so I'm okay there. So just standing on the pier, and I just had doing something stupid, and I just lost one of my, I was wearing those little flip-flops, and I just dropped that flip-flop into the ocean. And it just basically, there was no way to recover that because we were on the edge of the pier, and so no shoe now. And so what do? You basically are at a beach and you need the shoes. And normally, I wouldn't buy anything at the shoes, and we paid some crazy amount of money for really, really bad slippers. And it wasn't crazy amount. It was like maybe $35 or something that we bought at the store that was very close to the beach. And so that's your utility in use, right? Because I had to have the shoes to be able to go back home or do anything else, to go to dinner, whatever, right? So I was willing to pay for, even substandard shoes, $35 or whatever I paid that night or that day, that I would never have otherwise paid, because I needed to have that utility in use. So that's your example of utility in use. So if you need something, it's kind of the same thing. Why, on a hot day, you can get you get a bottle of water at, if you go to a sports, stadium or whatever, and it's a hot day, the bottle of water that you can get at Costco for like 30 cents or 50 cents or whatever, you pay like $5 for, right? It's the idea of utility in use, and that's how that gets defined. So always, utility is not something that has a constant value. Utility is a very nebulous concept, very sort of shifty concept in some ways. And it depends on whether you're talking about utility in exchange, utility in use, and everybody has their own sense of utility around it. So So you never quite define what utility is. You can have some measures of it, but those measures are very shifty in nature. So utility in exchange, benefit of goods or service as determined in the marketplace, in the open marketplace. Utility in use, the benefit of goods or services under conditions of use. And this is where you can think about why prices alone cannot measure cost. So price and cost are two different measures. And in our head, sometimes they get very intertwined. That the price and cost are related, but they're really not related. Price of something is determined by the demand that good or service has. The cost of service is actually, cost of a good or service is the cost of actually producing that good. And when we say somebody is charging fair prices, that means they're not making too much profit. That's how we think about it, right? And that's why costs and prices in our heads get very, very sort of all tied up and connected. But prices and costs are actually essentially completely different concepts. And you shouldn't treat price as a measure of cost. Price is a measure of demand in some ways, or it's a signal of how rare that commodity or service is, or how hard to get that commodity or services. Yes, cost maybe sometimes correlates that. Cost may be correlated with prices, but it has nothing, it doesn't always have to do everything with prices. Okay. So does that make sense? The idea of the difference between the concept of cost versus the concept of price. Any questions about that? Hearing no questions, I'm going to try to move on from this. Now the idea is of utility function. A utility function is a mathematical relationship which expresses the amount of utility associated with consumption of various combined quantities of goods and services. So this is the utility function that you may have seen in your CE 321, where we had defined utility of each mode, for example, right? So you had the function of output that was measure of utility equal to, and functional inputs are amounts consumed. And this is very related to production function, where we had the quantities produced on one side and the resources and the dollar amount consumed on the other side. So let's kind of look at it from an example. These definitions by themselves could be very esoteric, very confusing. But I think when you start to look at an example, things start to make a little bit more sense. So let's look at it from an example. So some of the issues that you encounter with the utility function, it's highly subjective. It cannot be physically measured. It varies among people, varies among situations. We've seen all of that. But it can be measured or estimated through revealed behavior. Okay? So let's see how that plays out. There are some more issues of utility function, especially in the transportation arena. So let's talk about that. The traditional economic theory defines utility in terms of quantities of goods and services consumed. Consuming more of something is usually considered better than consuming less. Okay, so if you consume more of something, that means you're in better shape, but not always. We'll talk about some examples of that. But in general, if there is more quantity being consumed, that's considered good. Transportation systems modelers often stretch this to define the utility in terms of attributes of the goods and services. So transportation systems modelers, they will stretch this to define the utility in terms of attributes of the goods and services. So for example, when we talk about transit, for example, and you've seen this function in CE321, the utility of taking an alternative transit mode to work, that will be a function of average headway, how frequent the bus is the bus too crowded, how many transfers do you need to make, do you feel safe in the bus, travel time, fare, all these other things. So you can create, based on probability of people that take that mode, you can back construct by all, you can do that with all these factors as your independent variables. And you can define utility of a mode based on all these factors that I'm telling you. Okay? So that's one way of constructing a utility function in the transportation realm. For a collection of comparable goods, services, or attributes, we can define that utility function. For example, a utility function for the purchase of a single family home in terms of floor space and yard space. Okay, so now we're getting to that point of the example. And how do we measure utility? We ultimately measure it based on the price. Okay? And if we say something sells for the same price, that means on average, people derive the same amount of utility. And now you have like sort of two quantities that are both desirable, right? In a single family home, both floor space and the yard space are desirable. More of floor space, more of yard space, they're both sort of desirable things. So let's think about now. So for example, you might say a 1,500 square foot floor space, and floor space is something that you will see square footage of the house. And then yard space will be dependent upon what's the square footage of the lot, the whole lot, with respect to the, and obviously this is very simplistic, because you could have utilities that are single level house versus a two-story house, a lot of things, and could define that. But I'm simplifying things just for us to be able to understand the concepts that are underlying the utility function. Okay, so I'm only considering two attributes of the single family home: the floor space and the yard space. And we'll define, if the house sells for the same price, we'll say that that house has two houses that sell for the same price have essentially the same utility. Let's look at this figure here. So I'm measuring utility on the z-axis. And these charts essentially define the utility. And you have like floor space and yard space, and they give people different utilities. And the idea is that obviously, if floor space and yard space are both high, okay, if there is high yard space and high floor space, so for example, if you're on the, let me get the annotations going, sorry. So if you have the both, so for example, if you're looking at sort of in a 3D space where both floor space and yard space are high, then that house will have the most utility. And then there is going to be a trade-off. If the floor space, obviously floor space cannot be zero, because then there is no house really. But if you look at it, if the floor space is small and the yard space is also small, then that house will have very less utility, right? So what you can do then is that this is a sort of a three-dimensional picture. It's still a little bit hard to imagine, but if you look at this figure right here and draw a vertical slice through the 3D function, and if you essentially cut a vertical slice through the 3D function, you can measure vertical slice through a 3D function means you're holding down one of the variables. Either you're holding yard space constant or a floor space constant. You're trying to only vary one of those variables, floor space or yard space. And then you're looking at how your utility changes along the axis. So any vertical slice that you cut, you hold one of those variables constant, and then you could see how the utility shifts with regards to the other variable. So here I'm cutting two vertical slices, one where floor space is 1,500 square feet, and one where the floor space is 1,800 square feet. Okay? Now think about this. Obviously, 1,800 square feet house will have more utility, compared to a 1,500 square feet house, right? That makes sense. But at the very beginning, like if there is no yard space in the house, then maybe they start out with the same utility. Nobody wants a house, a single family house, so to speak, that has no yard space. So whether you're at 1,500 or 1,800, your utility is fairly low. But as your yard space grows, 1,500 house will have a lower utility than an 1,800 square feet house. Okay? And then you can see the progression of the utility through as the yard space increases. Then there is this idea of the marginal utility. The idea of marginal utility is very interesting also, because you will see that all utility curves tend to flatten out as you progress forward. So the idea is that in this figure, the diminishing returns of utility if you look at this, in this figure, the curve becomes flatter towards the end. It rises sort of steeply, but then it becomes flatter because the idea is that once you get to, let's say, 7,000 square feet versus 10,000 square feet, you don't gain as much additional utility for that size of yard. Maybe you start thinking, hey, who's going to maintain that yard? And that starts to change that utility calculation. Yeah? So that's something to think about. So that's why it's a good idea to think of these, that there is always going to be a diminishing marginal return. And you can think of this as, I think I have a little picture on your Canvas page where you have, when you're really hungry, you really enjoy, if you get somebody offers you a cookie, you really enjoy that first cookie, or maybe even the second cookie. But if they keep offering you a cookie, and I'm assuming you're not a cookie monster, then you cannot just keep eating the cookie. So the utility, or what we call the marginal utility of consuming one extra cookie, starts to decline pretty rapidly. Right? So you get to like 4 or 5 cookies, and then you say, okay, I'm done now. I cannot have any more cookies. So what you try to do is that you try to come up with some theoretical functions that sort of have that property where the marginal utility, again, marginal utility will be the utility of consuming one more unit of the material. So you try to have these functions, K times ln Q. So natural log function has that property. And Cobb-Duck's function also has that property, where K is a constant, Q is the quantity demanded or consumed, and alpha is a constant also. And then Fechner's law is utility equal to K times ln Q. So fairly similar again. And Cobb-Duck's function is K times Q raised to power alpha. And again, you can choose values of alpha that make sure that this function has that diminishing utility function or diminishing marginal returns. Okay. Any questions about the utility function? Everybody clear on the idea of diminishing marginal return? Any thoughts, any questions about that? Okay, so let's think about this now. If we kind of think about this, if we cut like sort of like a horizontal slice, so instead of like cut, we created these curves by cutting a vertical slice through the 3D function that I showed you earlier. But if you cut a horizontal slice, essentially a slice that has constant utilities. So what I've done here is that I've cut 3 horizontal slices through this. Okay, so I've cut 3 different horizontal slices. And horizontal, remember, the z-axis was the utility value. So that means these 3 horizontal slices have the exact same utility. So the brown curve has U1 utility, this purple curve has C2, and the blue curve has U3 utility, okay? So these 3 curves has 3 different utility values. But the utility does not change along a single curve. So the utility is constant along each individual curve. And obviously U3 is higher than U2. So if we go back here, I'll show you the slice here. So what I'm doing here is that I'm cutting 3 different horizontal slices. I'm sorry. So I'm cutting 3 different horizontal slices here. Okay. Want you to tell me which one of these is U1 from the figure. So I'm going to show you that figure again. And now I'll come back to this slide. If you had to figure out which one of these is U1, which one of these is U2, and which one of these is U3 on the figure that I showed you before. Okay. So U1 is the lowest utility, U2 is the middle, and U3 is the highest utility. But as you know, we know that if you have more yard space and more floor space, that house will sell for higher price, everything else being equal, of course. And people will derive higher utility from it. So U3, which one of these is U3? Which one of these 3 lines is U3 is the question. Is it the bottom one or the top one? Please tell me via chat. I see some responses coming in. Yep. A few more people want to respond, please. Yes. So I see that. Oops, I'm sorry. So in this case, U3 will be the top one because it has the most utilities. Okay? So basically, you're cutting through a horizontal plane with the same horizontal line with the same utility, and you can find U3 being the highest utility. The lowest line would be U1 because it's the smallest house, and people derive fewest amount of utility. Now, the curves through which the curves that have exact same utility, we call them what we call indifference curves. Means along these curves. So basically what I'm saying is that people value 7,500 square feet house with about 9. Oops. So I'm going to try to redraw that. But about 1,800 square feet house and about 7,500 of yard space has the same utility as a 5,000 square feet house with or yard space house with $2,200, I mean 2,200 square feet of floor space. And you can think how this is reasonable, right? Because you can assume almost, yes, there may be that type of house might sell for a similar price. Because people derive the same, on average, people derive the same utility from it. So that's what this indifference curve is telling you. Now you have seen a good analogy for the indifference curves in the previous lecture. Do you remember the term that we used in the production theory for a curve that was analogous to the indifference curve that we're seeing here? I'll pause the recording. I'll let you guys think about it. Okay, so I got one response which was correct, so that's good to know, but not more than one, so which was not great. But in any event, yes, so we did have a curve like this in the production theory. An indifference curve has the same utility, and in the production theory we had what we call the isoquants. Isoquants mean they produce the same exact quantity of the output at different combinations of labor and utility. So if you sort of, if I want to draw it out, if I want to draw this out a little bit, if I want to just show you the analogy from last lecture, we had labor and we had capital, or bulldozer rather. Okay, so we had labor and bulldozer on X and Y axis, and instead of having utilities, we had amount of road constructed, right? So I'm showing you the analogy from the previous lecture, and then amount of road constructed, if they were the exact same, then we call them isoquants, right? So that's what we're dealing with. So just want you to see the analogy there. Very good. So let's clear this out. So this is analogous to what we call the isoquants. So indifference curves are basically like what we saw in the previous isoquants that we saw in the previous lecture. Okay, now let's kind of go back and clear out these annotations here. Now these prices are completely out of whack, especially for California. I don't even think in these days you can get this type of a house even in Detroit, Michigan. But let's now start to assign some prices to these things. Let's say the yard space sells for $5 per square feet. And floor space sells for $25 per square feet. And again, these are out of whack numbers, but let's go with these for now. Maybe I need to make them, 50. I need to add those zeros in there. But let's go with this. So what you're doing for your Honda Civic problem in your homework for production function, you can do that. You can create some similar thing that we had before that we call the expansion path. So if the yard space costs $5 per square feet and floor space costs $25 per square feet, you can create lines for your budget of buying a house. Let's say your budget is $50,000 versus 60,000 versus 75,000 and whatnot. Let's say you had $50,000 budget. If you want to derive the same utility, you would want to buy a house that has about maybe 3,000 square feet of yard space and maybe about 1,200 feet of square feet. Because if you spend $50,000 on any other house, so any other point in this curve, like if you were to buy a house here, buy a house here, those houses will cost the same in terms of yard space and floor space, but you won't be able to derive as much utility from it. So the yard space and floor space prices are there. It looks like I did lose my connection here for a second. So I'll repeat that. So if your budget was $50,000, if your budget was right here at $50,000, you would want to spend that $50,000 where the $50,000 budget line is tangent to a particular utility curve. You don't want to be here or right here. Why not? Because that will put you on a lower utility function curve for the same amount of money, $50,000. You're going to get lower utility out of that type of a house than you would get from that brown curve. So you should see the analogy, and then it should also be clear. So now if your budget becomes 75,000, now you can operate on this particular area of the curve. You can derive much higher utility. And if you kind of join those points of these where your budget curve becomes tangent to the utility curves, you can create what we call the expansion path. Meaning that as you get more and more money, as your budget goes up, how should you spend that budget on the relationship between floor space and yard space? Okay. So the expansion path is called the income consumption curve. It represents the locus of consumption for those with particular indifference curves given increasing budget. The expansion path for two normal goods, both desirable, is upward sloping. So like you see, both floor space and yard space are highly desirable. And what does that mean? That means that they both will have an upward sloping curve expansion path. If the expansion path curve back towards an axis, if your curve, so for normal sloping curves, the curve will always look like this. The curve will always be upward sloping for the normal goods, okay? But if you kind of think about it from an inferior good perspective, the inferior group might have sort of a backward sloping curve like this. So this would be the curve for inferior good. So if the expansion path curve is back towards an axis, that good is called an inferior good. Now, this is an interesting question. Can you think of an example where an expansion path could curve backwards? Is this something that sounds very unusual to you? Or do you think it could happen? What, can you think of some examples where you would see a curve like this that's backward sloping towards an axis, meaning that that particular commodity or service is an inferior service or an inferior good? Can you think of an example where the expansion path actually is backward sloping? So as you get more money, you use fewer of those goods and services. Any thoughts on that? Okay, so I see some interesting responses. Pretty good, actually. I like your responses. So the responses I heard from you guys are instant ramen noodle. That is exactly right. I know somebody mentioned the cheap cars or cheap furniture, lemon cards. That's right. You would use fewer of lemon cards as you get more money, and then you could think of that like I'm not sure what happened there, but I'm just going to start re-recording. So some really good responses from you guys. Instant ramen noodle. Yes, that's exactly right. That is, in fact, that type of a good where if you get more money, when you're no longer a student, and they start paying you big bucks, then you don't buy as much ramen noodle anymore. Cheap furniture from IKEA, same thing. When I was just, when we were young, we used to buy a lot of IKEA furniture. We don't do that anymore. First of all, I'm just too lazy to assemble it anymore. Just don't have the time to do it. Plus, we used to make IKEA trips when we used to go to big cities like LA or Bay Area. Yeah, so you don't do that. Once you start making a little bit more money, you don't do that anymore. And then the other example I got was like public transit. Fantastic example. That happens a lot. In fact, I'll show you a slide on that too. So if you get more money, so maybe you buy your own car, you don't use public transit anymore. Although that's obviously a regional preference too. So we'll talk about that too. But yeah, you guys have gotten that concept exactly right. That's exactly what I'm talking about. For these types of goods, there might be a backward sloping curve. So let's think about, so this is one example, the sightseeing trips. You have two goods, sightseeing trips by limo and sightseeing trips by bus. An expansion path is basically as your budget goes up, what happens to these two services, consumption of these two services. If you have a lot of money, or if you have no money, basically, and maybe you make very few trips with limo, and you don't even make that many trips by bus. You can't really do too much sightseeing. Start get more money, then you say, okay. Oops. What happens here? You start to get a little bit more money, and you say, all right, so I'm gonna spend some money on sightseeing, and I'm gonna have more sightseeing by bus, more by limo. Now you get really big money. You say, okay, maybe I'll do some sightseeing by bus, but most of my sightseeing is now by limo. That's fantastic. So now you got even more money. So your expansion path. So you could see, you can tell, even if I didn't tell you these axis labels, you could tell which way the curve slopes. If it turns downwards, then you know that downward side is your inferior good. And if I flip the axis, if I would have flipped this axis, then my curve would have looked something like this. It would have turned that way. If I had flipped the axis and my limousine trips were on the y-axis and my bus trips were on the x-axis. Does that make sense? Right? Questions about this? I'll move on. So in the case of, if you wanna, angle curve would be one where you have one good versus the income. So basically you treat one of the elements as the exact same. So what we're doing here is that you fix the yard space. You fix the yard space that you want to buy. And then for $50,000 versus $75,000, how much more floor space can you buy if you fix the right? So if you just kind of do it with one good and income, we call it angle curve. Okay? So in that, we have fixed yard space. You could do the same thing with floor space. You could fix the floor space and do the chart with yard space. Now, this could get very interesting if you were to you can think of this now as how consumption of a good varies with its price. How consumption of a good changes as the price changes. If you think about this, what would happen is that, let's say, if your budget was $75,000 and floor space was $25 per square feet, then you probably had, oops, okay. So now let's see, I'm going to annotate with this. So when the floor space was selling for $25 per square feet, and this was your curve, and then you could get this U3 utility. You could get this U3 utility for yourself at $75,000. Now let's say the price of floor space now becomes $40 per square feet. Your budget remains the same. The price of floor space went up, but your budget remains the same. What would happen? Your optimum path now actually won't get you U3. It can only now get you U2 because your budget line now is tangent to only this curve. So you see what I'm doing here? I'm essentially increasing the price of floor space. I'm keeping the yard space price the same, $5 per square feet, but I'm now making the floor space price to be $40 per square feet rather than just 25. What does that do for me? That shifts my budget curve, not in parallel anymore because the price ratio between yard space and floor space have changed. But now my budget curve looks like this. It used to be like this up here. It used to be like this, but now it's like this. It used to be like this right here, but now it's like this. And they're not parallel lines anymore. So you can only divide U2 amount of utility as the optimal $75,000 budget. Okay. Now, if you join these points, they give rise to what we call the demand curve. The demand curve for floor space. You get what we call the demand curve for floor space. At 25 and 40, how the demand for floor space changes. And you can see that you cannot get that because you're moving away. You're moving to a different utility curve. And that's why the quantity of floor space that you can command goes down. Does that make sense to you? And then this is your downward slope in demand curve. If the price goes up for something, its demand goes down. And we get that from the Engel curve. Engel curve, right? So we get that from that. And again, obviously for that, we have fixed the price of yard space. We are not changing the price of yard space, just dealing with one curve. And then because you want to derive the demand curve for floor space. And then obviously if the price went up even further, the demand will come down even further at $50 per square feet of floor space. So now, remember, note the axis. This is the price of per square feet, the unit price of floor space. This is quantity of floor space demanded. And as the price goes up, the quantity demanded comes down. Because it kind of you move to a lower and lower utility function for the same budget. Obviously, you're assuming that your total budget remains the same. Any questions about this? No questions, so I'll move on to the next slide then. Okay, let me just clear out this one. Okay. So demand curve, definition of demand curve is the amount of good that will be bought or the services that will be consumed at each price level for that good, given fixed income, fixed utility function, fixed prices for all competing goods, fixed service attributes. So everything else being fixed. If the price of a particular good changes, how much the quantity demanded will change. And remember, this always assumes utility maximizing behavior. You always assume that you're trying to maximize your utility. And demand curve is, in fact, downward sloping always. Now, you could do the same thing, just like you can create demand curve in a 2-dimension, you could create what we call the demand surface, okay? So if you had two competing goods, price of floor space and price of yard space, and as the price of both increase or decrease, you can create a 3-dimensional surface. And then based on that, you can figure out two things. You can figure out demand curve and also what we call the cross demand curve. Because see, what happens is that if you go back to the utility function that I showed you, right? I changed the price of floor space in this example, and you came down from U3 to U2. And because you came down from U3 to U2, what did you do here? You couldn't buy as much of the floor space, but what happened to the yard space that you could buy now, or that you would buy now to be at U2 at the same budget? So so my question is, I'm going to try to type it here. Could you note what happened to the amount of yard space demanded when floor space prices? Now, do you notice what happened? Tell me what happened as the price of floor space went up. What happened to the amount of yard space demand? Did it remain the same? Did the amount of yard space remain the same when the price of floor space went up? You can respond via chat. Questions is, what happened to the amount of yard space? Did it go up or down as the floor space prices went up? So yeah, that's very good. So I see some responses here that the yard space demanded actually went up as you amount of yard space demanded went up when the competing goods prices went up. Right? That makes sense because now you're at a lower utility, so because you cannot get as much floor space anymore. But you can, to get the same amount of utility, the U2 utility, now you're demanding more yard space. And that could happen. And this idea is what's reflected in what we call cross elasticity. What happens to the price of competing, the quantity demanded for a competing good when the price of a particular good goes up or down. Okay, so let's go back for a slide. That's what we call the cross demand curve that plots. A demand curve is what plot the quantity for the same goods or service. A cross demand curve is quantity for the competing goods or service. So you be very careful and note that so look very carefully. These things are two different things. Cross demand curve is quantity of floor space versus price of yard space. So when you put a little cross in front of it, remember the subscripts are different. Okay? And demand curve has the same subscript. Now remember, the chart I showed you about the limousine, don't forget that chart. For inferior goods, can lead to backward sloping demand curves, means higher prices, meaning more demand. I think those are called Giffen goods. Like inferior goods, they're sometimes called Giffen goods. And sometimes, you know, they give the example in traditional economics, they give the example of meat versus bread. If the price of bread goes up, oh, I'm sorry. If the price of meat goes up, sometimes you would expect people to be buying more bread. I'm sorry, if the price of bread goes up, you expect people to be buying more meat maybe, but that doesn't happen because so the two goods in that case will be bread and meat, and bread and meat both are sort of desirable. So you would expect them to behave in a way that when price of meat goes up, when the price of bread goes up, people would be able to consume more meat, but that doesn't happen. When the price of bread goes up, meat is even more out of budget for some families, and they have to buy even more bread. Even if that was ultimately this thing started because price of bread went up, that doesn't lead to reduction in consumption of the bread. It actually leads to an increase because the families who could previously afford meat cannot afford meat anymore. So they have to go for the cheaper alternative. And I'm assuming, obviously, the price of bread is lower than price of meat. So this is the idea of inferior goods can lead to backward sloping demand curves. Okay, that means higher price means more demand. So when the price of bread goes up, the demand for bread goes up as well because the families can't afford meat anymore. Transportation demand, that is in a special case of travel demand theory. Travel demand, and I'm not going to go into very much detail, I'm going to stop here. This is a slightly different discussion now. But I'm going to stop by saying we're going to start talking about transportation demand from here on out. And transportation demand is a special case of the normal demand theory. And we demand transportation demand as a derived demand because the demand for transportation doesn't exist on its own, but because of the place utility obtained by moving people or goods to other locations. And there are a few exceptions to this because there are some scenic routes, for example, where people just want to drive. Okay, so their demand is actually, the transportation demand is not derived because people are driving because they want to be able to drive that route. I think there is a 18-mile road or whatever in Monterey that you would think of that way. But mostly the demands that we plan for in the transportation profession are in fact derived demand. And we talk about that in CE 321 as well. So you should be very familiar with that. So now what we're going to do in the next class is trying to correlate what we've learned about demand for competing goods and different goods and all that, and trying to bring that discussion to transportation demand. With that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop right here. And unless you guys have any questions, you guys are free to go.